Hey guys, today I want to talk about the drawbacks of getting too attached to the plans we make. I started reflecting on this idea after reading the book Time Surfing by Paul Lumens. Personally, I find planning really useful, but I've also found that the more rigid and inflexible we are with the plans we make, the more riskier that they'll make us ineffective. I want to explore some of those reflections in this video. But first, let's get out of the way why planning is important and necessary in the first place. Alright, so the good side of planning. At its best, goal setting and planning allows us to clarify what our values are and then make goals and plans that are in line with those values. And when we start taking action towards those goals, then we get a sense of confidence and purpose, since we know that the way we're spending our time is meaningful because it's in line with our values and where we want to go, as opposed to drifting from here to there or just doing whatever, or maybe going along with someone else's agenda even if it doesn't align with where we want to head towards. Of course, the benefit comes if we actually take action and work towards our goals. If we simply make goals but then we don't really do anything about it, then that's another problem and sort of a different story, right? Overall, to me, I think it's a great tool because it helps us figure out where we want to go and how we want to get there. So it's a habit that I think is really worthwhile developing and actually implementing. All right, so what's the actual risk when it comes to making plans? I would say the risk doesn't lie within the plans themselves, but it's when our mind gets attached to the plans. That's when there can be problems, especially when things don't go to plan. And that's quite likely to happen, and it's definitely going to happen sooner or later. I noticed this in myself where I would get attached to the plans I make, but having reflected on what's happened in the past quite a bit, I get better at recognizing it, and I feel like simply recognizing it sort of helps solve most of the problem, for me at least. So what does being attached to a plan actually mean? To me, being attached means we have a neediness and a tenseness where we need the future to unfold exactly according to the plans we made. And why is getting attached to our plans bad? It's not that bad when things go exactly to plan, but the thing is, things often don't go to plan, and if we're too attached, then we don't respond very well when things don't go to plan. It's also bad if we're prone to being attached to the plans we make, because if we make plans often, then we'll fall into this trap quite often. So it's a really good thing to be aware of and know how to address. All right, so let's go into the drawbacks of being attached a bit further. So what happens when we get too attached to our plans? Firstly, it makes us prone to responding negatively when deviations happen in the plan. These deviations can be things taking longer than expected, other people taking longer than expected, dips in your own energy levels, changing the weather conditions, emergencies, etc., etc. Like, deviations always happen, but if we are too attached to the initial plan, then when they happen, we needlessly react negatively, and that doesn't make us effective at all. And often, it's really in our interest to adapt the plan and change course, though if we're too attached, we might experience a lot of resistance to adapting, or we might even refuse to adapt at all against our own interests. If we were clear and rational, we'd assess if the plan needs changing, and if it needs changing, then we just change it and carry on. In short, if we're too attached, it makes us feel bad about adapting, and we also might be bad at adapting or not adapt at all to our detriment. That's a risk. And the other drawback is we automatically dismiss all distractions as bad. When we first hear this, it might seem self-evident that all distractions are bad, but actually, when things come up through the day and distract us, sometimes they could be real distractions, like bad distractions, and other times they could be opportunities. Sometimes obvious opportunities, sometimes opportunities in disguise. There are times when attending to these distractions might actually be in line with our goals, but again, if we're too attached to the original plan we made, we might just react negatively to anything that wasn't part of the original plan, and we might be missing out on some opportunities. I guess the takeaway is it would be ideal if we'd be able to discern between bad distractions, such as mindless scrolling on social media, and good distractions, such as opportunities in disguise. And even sometimes you might need help or someone else might need help, and you don't really want to be automatically dismissive, like automatically dismiss everything just because you didn't account for it in the first place in the original plan. So why do we get attached to our plans in the first place? So I think the first reason is when we make plans, we get excited about them, we get really keen, and we just really look forward to what we projected in the future, and we really want it to happen. And if it doesn't happen, we feel bad. When we make such plans, it gives us a sense of comfort, stability, and it helps us feel like we're in charge of our future and we're charting it out, etc. So changing the plans or anything that wrecks the plan jeopardizes this feeling of comfort and stability. However, the issue is we forget that plans are fundamentally just an estimation of the future. They're pretty much just thoughts that were made at some point in the past. Thoughts and intentions and estimations about how the future should be or how we would like it to be. And I think they provide a good estimation, but if we treat them as 100% perfect and accurate predictions of the future, forgetting the fact that they're merely estimations, it makes us prone to attachment. Personally, I find sometimes it's easy to forget that plans are simply just an estimation, just an intention, just a thought. And that's when I might feel some resistance when things change. Though I find simply remembering that fact quite effective and liberating. And it's easier to accept that things were going to change. And having remembered that, it helps me realize that the rigid expectations were unreasonable in the first place. So what should we actually do now that we recognize there's a drawback to being too attached to the plans we make? It's quite risky, yet we also know that planning is quite necessary and it's such a good tool. So obviously it's too valuable a tool to simply discard and just go with the flow. So here's how I think we can be more skillful and balanced with planning. My first tip is a practical planning tip, and it's to overestimate how long you think a task is going to take. And we overestimate that to ourselves and when we communicate the expectations with others. And also prepare yourself mentally that although we overestimated it, it might take even longer than that overestimation. So I find this tip particularly valuable because I tend to always underestimate how long something is going to take. So it's a habit I'm trying to remember to always overestimate. And I guess it's always better to underpromise and overdeliver, especially when there are other people involved and expecting you to complete tasks, as opposed to we overpromise and underdeliver. And I guess setting reasonable expectations and estimates is an art. And if you're on the side of the spectrum where you tend to underestimate the difficulty of tasks and how long they'll take, like me, then it's a good tactic to overestimate to correct for that bias. Although, however helpful this tip might be, it doesn't make us immune to changes in plan, changes in the schedule, because deviations are going to happen. So that leads me to my next tip, which is we need to be aware and mindful of when we're reacting negatively to change. So an example might be when things are taking longer than expected, or when something comes and throws our plan out for the day. We should think to ourselves, is this actually catastrophic? And maybe ask, were my assumptions reasonable to begin with? And I guess if we were assuming that our plan would be perfect, then that's where we would remember, okay, well, the assumption wasn't reasonable to begin with. So when we notice this tension or anxiety, I find it useful just to remind myself that the plans were just intentions, assumptions about how the day would go, a best guess, like an approximate estimate. That's all it was in the first place. And if we hold ourselves to 100% adherence, this creates unnecessary friction and it just sets us up for failure. I find remembering this is pretty liberating as we remember the nature of plans and we don't have unreasonable expectations of our plans. All right, next step is to stop seeing all distractions as bad. Even when they're distractions we don't need to attend to, it's still not good to negatively react to them. So my tip would be to not be so surprised when distractions arise. And when they do arise, discern whether they're worth attending to or not, because they're not always worth dismissing. Sometimes there are things that come and distract us that actually align with our goals, and it's worth considering whether we should attend to them there and there by changing the plan, or we should just continue with the plan because that's the right thing to do. Not because it was part of the original plan, but because it's actually the right thing to do at that point in time. And my final tip, which is actually a tip from time surfing, is to incorporate breathers into the schedule and use that time to detach from the tasks we're focusing on and create space so that we can use our intuition, ask ourselves, how are we feeling? Is the next thing on the schedule the right thing to do, or does the plan need adjusting, for example? So this tip is really cool because it takes into account the fact that plans can't be perfect, and therefore we intentionally set times throughout the day where we take a break, we detach from our tasks that we're doing. That detachment might even help us solve the task with more creativity. In the context of this video, what it does is it gives us a chance to pause, take a breather, and check in with how we're feeling. Then we can decide if we want to continue what we're doing or does doing something else make more sense given how we feel at that time and given the new information we have that we didn't have at the time when we initially, maybe at the beginning of the day? Yeah, so these pauses and breathers help us from rigidly forcing a plan that no longer fits. To sum up, if we acknowledge the limits of planning and we're mindful of how we feel when things don't go to plan, and we don't see all distractions as bad now, but we respond appropriately whether we need to attend to a distraction or not, and we have breathers throughout the day so that we can use our intuition to see how we feel and change the plan if needed, then I reckon we could still enjoy the benefits of planning without falling into the traps. Yeah, anyway, I hope that was useful. Those are some of my recent reflections regarding the drawbacks of planning. If anyone has any thoughts, please comment. Otherwise, thanks for listening, and I hope it was interesting or helpful or entertaining.